Every Sunday morning across America, something is happening that nobody wants to talk about. Empty pews, silent sanctuaries, churches that once overflowed with worshipers now struggle to fill the first few rows. In a small town in Vermont, Pastor Thompson unlocks the doors of First Baptist Church at 9:30 a.m. like he has for 37 years. He turns on the lights. He starts the coffee. He arranges the bulletins. By 10 a.m., when the service begins, 17 people are sitting in a sanctuary built for 300. 17 people in a building that cost $2 million. 17 people trying to sing hymns in a space so empty you can hear the echo of your own voice. Pastor Thompson told me something that keeps him awake at night. My church used to have 400 members. We had 3 services every Sunday. We had a youth group of 80 kids. We had mission trips and Bible studies and a waiting list for the nursery. He paused, and his voice broke. Now I'm not sure we'll make it through the year, and we're not alone. Every pastor I know is watching their church slowly die, but nobody's talking about it. This is bigger than anyone realizes. This is America's hidden church crisis. And what's happening right now will reshape Christianity in ways we're only beginning to understand. Today, we're investigating a crisis that's been unfolding in plain sight, yet remains invisible to most Americans. The quiet collapse of the American church. This isn't about one denomination or one theological dispute. This is about the systemic unraveling of institutional Christianity across every tradition, every region, and every demographic. The numbers tell a story that should alarm every Christian in America. 3 in 10 Americans now attend religious services regularly, down from 42% just 2 decades ago. Pre-pandemic, approximately 3,500 people left religious congregations every day. That's 1.2 million walking away from church every year. Roughly 84% of American churches are plateaued or declining. 68% of churches have congregations of fewer than 100 people, including 31% who have fewer than 50. But here's what makes this crisis different from previous declines. The youngest cohort of adults is no less religious than the second youngest cohort, which means the decline may be stabilizing, but at a dramatically lower baseline than previous generations. We're witnessing the largest transformation of American religious life since the Great Awakening. Only this time, instead of revival, we're watching retreat. Instead of growth, collapse. Instead of renewal, abandonment. This investigation will reveal what's really causing the crisis, why institutional Christianity failed to see it coming, and what this means for the future of faith in America. Because what's happening in empty churches across this country isn't just about attendance numbers. It's about the end of Christendom as we've known it, and whether what comes next will look anything like the church that came before. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to when American Christianity was at its peak. The 1950s and early 1960s represented the high water mark of religious participation in American life. Church attendance rates hit historic highs. Much of the decline is driven by the increase in the percentage of Americans with no religious affiliation. In 2000 to 2003, 9% of U.S. adults said they were not affiliated with a religious group. Now it's 21%. New church buildings went up in every suburb. Being seen in church on Sunday was essential to social respectability and professional success. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The civil rights movement exposed how segregated and complicit many white churches were in systems of racial oppression. The Vietnam War divided congregations along generational and political lines. The sexual revolution challenged traditional teachings about marriage and morality. By the 1970s, mainline Protestant denominations, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Lutheran, began experiencing steady membership declines they've never reversed. The rise of the Christian right in the 1980s temporarily masked these trends by mobilizing evangelical political activism. The 1990s and early 2000s saw the megachurch boom, with pastors like Rick Warren and Bill Hybels pioneering seeker-sensitive models that drew massive crowds. For a moment, it seemed like American Christianity had found a formula for relevance. But the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of the religious nones, the increasing visibility of clergy sex abuse scandals, and the church's entanglement with partisan politics created a perfect storm. Young adults who grew up in church began leaving in unprecedented numbers. Then came COVID-19. In the 4 years before the pandemic, 2016 through 2019, an average of 34% of U.S. adults said they had attended church in the past 7 days. From 2020 to the present, the average has been 30%. That 4-point drop represents millions of Americans who simply stopped going to church and never came back. 20% of Americans say they are attending in person less often than before the pandemic, while 7% say they are going in person more often. Church attendance is down 4 points among Protestants, from 44% to 40%, and 7 points among Catholics, from 37% to 30%, the two largest faith groups in the U.S. But the pandemic only accelerated trends that were already in motion. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, 35% say they have no religious preference compared to 32% who identify as Protestant/non-denominational Christian or 19% as Catholic. Young adults, both those with and without a religious preference, are much less likely to attend religious services. 22% attend regularly, 8 points below the national average. The geographic divide is stark. Vermont, 75%, New Hampshire, 66%, and Maine, 66%, have the highest share of adults who say they never or seldom attend church or religious services, while Mississippi, 32%, Alabama, 36%, and Louisiana, 37%, have the lowest share. Churches are closing at alarming rates. Small-town churches that anchored communities for generations are shuttering because they can't afford to keep the lights on. Urban churches are selling their buildings to developers who turn them into condos and breweries. The financial strain is crushing. Churches built for 300 with budgets based on that attendance now have 75 people trying to maintain buildings, pay staff, and fund programs designed for much larger congregations. Pastors are burning out and leaving ministry in record numbers. Seminary enrollment is plummeting. Denominations are cutting staff and consolidating regional offices. This isn't a temporary dip that will bounce back. This is structural collapse that's redefining what it means to be the church in America. Let me show you the mechanisms driving this collapse, because understanding what's happening is essential to grasping what comes next. First, the generational shift. Although nearly 50% of people attended church weekly as a child, only 20% attend weekly as adults. 25% of millennials who attended church regularly for at least a year as a teenager say they stopped attending because they disagreed with the church's stance on political or social issues. Young adults aren't just attending less frequently, they're fundamentally questioning whether institutional Christianity aligns with their values. They watch church leaders excuse sexual abuse. They saw churches embrace partisan politics. They experienced judgment rather than grace when they asked hard questions. Second, the digital revolution. 20% of churchgoers attend exclusively online, while another 26% use a hybrid model of online and in-person church attendance. COVID forced churches online, and many discovered they could attend from their couch. The convenience factor is hard to overcome. Third, the trust crisis. High-profile scandals involving celebrity pastors, financial corruption in ministries, and churches protecting abusers have devastated institutional credibility. When Hillsong, Mars Hill, and Harvest Bible Chapel all imploded within a few years of each other, millions of young evangelicals concluded that maybe the problem isn't just individual bad leaders, but the systems that produce and protect them. Fourth, the cultural capture. Both progressive and conservative churches made the same fatal mistake. They allowed their Christian identity to be subsumed by political identity. Highly religious Americans tend to identify with or lean toward the Republican Party at much higher rates than do the least religious Americans. When Christianity became synonymous with a political party, millions of people who didn't share that party's politics concluded Christianity wasn't for them. Fifth, the failure to address real questions. Churches that demanded intellectual conformity without creating space for honest doubt drove away their most thoughtful members. Young adults asking questions about science, suffering, sexuality, and social justice were often met with simplistic answers or hostility. Sixth, the economic reality. Leading experts say a church should expect to lose about 10% to 15% of its members year over year. This creates a death spiral. Declining attendance leads to budget cuts, which leads to reduced programs, which leads to more people leaving, which leads to more cuts. The institutional response has largely been denial or superficial solutions. Denominational leaders talk about reimagining and innovation while the buildings burn down around them. Pastor Jennifer grew up Southern Baptist and felt called to ministry as a teenager. She graduated from seminary with debt and idealism in equal measure. Her first church was a rural congregation in Arkansas with 85 members, most over 60. She poured herself into that community for 7 years. She preached, visited the sick, performed weddings and funerals, ran the youth group, led Bible studies, and worked a part-time job because the church couldn't afford to pay her a living wage. By year 7, attendance had dropped to 42. The budget couldn't support her salary anymore. The building needed a new roof the church couldn't afford. She left ministry entirely and now works in nonprofit administration. "I still believe in Jesus," she told me, "but I don't believe in the institutional church anymore. It feels like we're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic while pretending everything's fine. I gave that church everything I had, and it wasn't enough because the problem isn't lack of effort. The problem is that the model is broken and nobody wants to admit it." Marcus is 28 and grew up in a large evangelical megachurch in the suburbs of Atlanta. He was there every time the doors opened. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night youth group, mission trips, worship band, small groups. When he came out as gay at 22, his church told him he needed to choose between his identity and his faith. He tried to stay. He attended a Christian counseling program that promised to change his sexual orientation. It didn't work. It just left him with trauma and a crisis of faith. "I don't go to church anymore," Marcus said. "Not because I stopped believing in God, but because I couldn't stay in a community that told me I had to hate myself to be loved by God. And I'm not alone. I know dozens of LGBTQ people my age who grew up in church and left because they couldn't reconcile who they are with what they were taught. The church is losing an entire generation because it chose theology over people." Sarah and Tom are in their 60s and have been pillars of their Methodist church for 35 years. They taught Sunday school, served on committees, gave generously, and raised their 3 children in that community. Their church voted to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church over LGBTQ inclusion. The congregation split almost down the middle. Families that had worshiped together for decades stopped speaking. Their youngest son, who is gay, stopped coming to family gatherings because he couldn't handle the theological arguments. "We lost our church and almost lost our family," Sarah said. "We stayed because we believe in inclusion, but half our friends left and won't talk to us. Our son barely talks to his father. I watch what's happening and wonder if it was worth it. I wonder if Jesus looks at what we're doing and recognizes any of it as his church." Tyler is 19 and grew up in a non-denominational church in suburban Ohio. He was baptized at 13, went on mission trips, led worship, and planned to attend Bible college. Then COVID hit. His church refused to follow public health guidelines, claiming masks were government overreach and vaccines were the mark of the beast. When Tyler's grandmother died of COVID after catching it at church, his parents blamed her weak faith rather than admitting the church's actions had consequences. "I stopped believing any of it," Tyler said. "Not the core stuff about Jesus, but all the cultural and political stuff that the church acted like was just as important. When I started asking questions, I was told I was being deceived by Satan. So I left, and I'm never going back." The turning point that accelerated this crisis wasn't a single dramatic event. It was COVID-19, which functioned like a massive stress test revealing structural weaknesses that had been ignored for decades. In July 2020, when many churches were closed to physical worshipers, 41% of adults said they had joined in religious services either in person or virtually in the past month. Most of them, 27% of all U.S. adults, said they had participated only virtually. Churches that had operated on the assumption that people attended out of commitment discovered that many were attending out of habit. When the habit was disrupted, the commitment evaporated. The pandemic exposed how much of American church culture was about social performance rather than spiritual formation. When you could no longer see and be seen at church, many people discovered they didn't miss it as much as they thought they would. It revealed the shallowness of digital connection. Virtual church worked for some, but for many it felt hollow and transactional. Yet once people got used to attending in pajamas from their couch, the barrier to returning in person felt higher. It exposed theological and political fault lines that had been papered over. Churches that embraced conspiracy theories and rejected public health guidance lost members who couldn't stomach the marriage of Christianity to right-wing politics. Churches that closed for extended periods lost members who felt abandoned by their community during crisis. The pandemic was the moment when millions of marginal attenders became non-attenders. And unlike previous disruptions, many haven't come back and likely never will. What does this crisis reveal about the future of American Christianity? Let me offer some predictions that I believe are grounded in the data and trends we're seeing. First, the era of the large institutional church is ending for most of America. The 62% Christian figure is smack in the middle of the recent range between 60% and 64%, suggesting the decline may be stabilizing but at a much lower level than previous generations. We're not returning to 1950s level participation. That world is gone. Second, we're entering an era of Christian minority status in many parts of America. More than 3/4 of Americans say religion's role in public life is shrinking, the highest level since tracking began in 2001. Christianity will increasingly be a countercultural choice rather than a default social identity. Third, the churches that survive will be smaller, more committed, and more costly to belong to. The days of casual Christianity where showing up occasionally was enough are over. Future churches will require genuine commitment because they won't have the resources to sustain the infrastructure of Christendom. Fourth, denominational structures will continue collapsing. The bureaucratic model of denominational hierarchy can't be sustained with declining membership and giving. We'll see more independent churches, more church plants, and more networks rather than denominations. Fifth, the political captivity of the church will drive more people away unless leaders find the courage to disentangle Christian faith from partisan politics. The U.S. is politically polarized, and religion is closely associated with the country's political divisions. This association is toxic to younger generations. Sixth, theological triage will become essential. Churches will have to decide which doctrines are essential and which are disputable, because fighting over secondary and tertiary issues while the house burns down is suicidal. Seventh, the remnant that remains will be more diverse. Non-white millennials are attending church weekly at 45% compared to 35% of white millennials. The future American church will be less white, less suburban, and less tied to traditional evangelical culture. Eighth, new forms of Christian community will emerge. House churches, missional communities, online gatherings, and hybrid models will proliferate as people seek connection without the baggage of institutional religion. What most people don't realize is that this isn't the death of Christianity. It's the death of a particular cultural expression of Christianity that dominated America for generations. What comes next could be more authentic, more costly, and more faithful to Jesus than what we're losing. But the transition will be painful. Buildings will close. Denominations will shrink. Careers will end. The church as we've known it is dying. The question is whether we have the courage to let it die so something new can be born. I think about Pastor Thompson in that Vermont church with 17 people in a sanctuary built for 300. I think about the grief he carries, the sense of failure, the wondering if he did something wrong. Here's what I want to say to every pastor, every church leader, every believer watching the collapse and feeling despair. This is not your fault. You didn't cause this crisis. You inherited it. The American church built an empire on cultural Christianity, on social conformity, on being respectable and powerful and influential. We built bigger buildings and launched bigger programs and created bigger budgets. We measured success by numbers: attendance, budgets, square footage, staff size. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that Jesus started with 12 and ended up crucified. We forgot that the early church met in homes and faced persecution. We forgot that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, not a mighty oak. Maybe what we're experiencing isn't collapse. Maybe it's pruning. Maybe God is stripping away everything we've added to the gospel until all that's left is Jesus. The question isn't whether the American church will survive this crisis. The question is what kind of church will emerge on the other side. Will it be a church that finally puts Jesus ahead of politics? That values compassion over culture war? That welcomes the marginalized instead of weaponizing theology against them? That prioritizes formation over information, community over programs, and love over being right? I don't know, but I'm hopeful, because every ending is also a beginning. Every death contains the seed of resurrection. Every wilderness is preparation for promised land. The church Jesus built has survived Roman persecution, medieval corruption, Protestant fragmentation, Enlightenment skepticism, and totalitarian opposition. It will survive American decline too. But it won't look like what we're used to, and that's okay, because maybe, just maybe, it will look more like Jesus. The buildings may be emptying, the institutions may be crumbling, the empire may be falling, but the gospel remains. The presence of Christ remains. The promise remains. And that, brothers and sisters, is the only foundation that will never collapse. Subscribe to Christian Faith Archive, because the church you know is ending, but the church Jesus is building never will.